Hyper offense, a playstyle focused on keeping up the pressure with pivoting and blitzing the opposing teams with pressuring hazards and plenty of strong wall breakers. This playstyle has been asleep for the past years of Lumion Legacy's metagame. However, thanks to recent hazard setters like Gopidemic, Seer Knight, Wobblisk, Lumions with power and speed potential like Totem and Wintrix, any common defensive staples with great utility like Luminami and Tyrex, Hyper Offense has made its presence known as one of the strongest playstyles in the entire game. So naturally, today's video is all about that. From explaining how Hyper Offense works, the explanation of roles Lumions can play, to Lumions that fit on Hyper Offense, the general templates on Hyper Offense teams, and knowing how to defeat Hyper Offense for yourself, today's video is all about how to play and defeat Hyper Offense. Quick disclaimer here, before we get started, you should know that a Lumion isn't forced or should be used for one singular purpose. The great thing about Hyper Offense in this game is that most roles can be played by different teammates on a team, so you're not limited to running the same type of team. For example, Deldrix can be a good cleaner and revenge killer, but it can also be a wall breaker when it needs to because of its high range attack stat. This gives more diversity to your teams and frankly gives your opponent a brain aneurysm whenever they try predicting what Lumions you're going to bring. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about the first section, rules or general knowledge you should know about Hyper Offense. Unlike other playstyles, Hyper Offense is the most straightforward and easy strategy. An important thing to know during these fast-paced matches is you need to create pressure. Pressure can come from multiple factors, from setting up hazards for damage, your wall breakers having threatening coverage or setting up, or your cleaners threatening with fast speed. Pressure can come from many things. You want to make it feel like your opponent is fighting an uphill battle and you must do everything in your power to make them feel like they're being pressured. Forcing your opponent into very dangerous 50-50 situations that will decide the match is very key here because since almost all of your Lumions are offensive, pretty much anything can happen in this game. With this mindset in mind, you'll find success very fast even if you start losing battles. Hyper Offense is a tough strategy to work around, especially when you've been fighting other playstyles in the past few updates, so just know that you're not in this alone. Another rule to abide by is to never be afraid to sack or let your Lumions die. This is an unnecessary rule, but it's an important thing to take note of. Since your team is already offensively oriented, your main priority is to do damage. Always seeking out opportunities to break walls and holes in the opposing team to make way for your other Lumions. This rule also works in tandem with the third rule of Hyper Offense, and that is to constantly seek opportunities for double switching and predicting your opponent's moves to get your Lumions into the battle. Because most of your offensive Lumions are most likely frail, predicting switches can be great ways to get your offensive Lumions in the battle without taking damage and still keeping up pressure. This is going to be hard at first, but this skill will develop further more you keep battling. The alternative to this case is of course using Lumions that have pivot moves to chip walls down and switch into Lumions that have comfortable matchups with those walls. This seems to be a very good theme in the common metagame, especially when stuff like Phase Knot and Deldrix are getting used because of their pivot moves. It will be very great for you to adopt that strategy as well. Alright, with the roles done, let's talk about the strategies. For starting off the match, 9 times out of 10, you need to lead with your hazard setter / suicide lead. This is to maximize the amount of damage to cripple whatever defensive Lumion is going to be switching in later in the battle. After your suicide lead has done its job, your next priority is to start breaking walls for your sweeper. Based on the Lumion in front of you, you can choose to go into your choice of wall breaker if it has a good matchup or a defensive / offensive pivot to predict the opponent's next move. This is the stage in the game that can be very simple or very complicated very fast. Take your time thinking. Even though Hyper Offense is going to last very few match rounds, you need to take your time thinking because you're going to be forced into a lot of dangerous 50-50s that you have to take in order to win. Hyper Offense is not an easy strategy like I said, so after you've broken some or not most of the walls, then it's time to go into your setup sweeper. Some things to take into account is the current state of the match. If your setup sweeper already has great matchups against the opponent's Lumions even if the walls aren't chipped, then you might save yourself some time. Just remember that the state of the battle is very important when accounting for your next few moves, so just think before you choose. The final step of this strategy is to clean whatever is remaining on the opposing team. This Lumion for the job can range for your wall breakers, sweepers, or cleaners. Just remember to keep a fast Lumion before the match ends, so you have a higher chance of outspeeding and doing the damage first. With the strategies out of the way, let's talk about the roles and the general team setup of Hyper Offense. Lead position is what makes or breaks your Hyper Offense team. Unlike wall breakers or sweepers, this in theory is a pretty flexible slot. Using your suicide leads in the beginning of the battle, they will have to have some way to set up hazards or rack up as much damage for your wall breakers to have an easy job. So in theory, defensive barb setters like Seer Knight and Wobblisk can be great leads. But the strongest aspect that a lead needs to is to stop the opponent from setting up. There's only one Lumion currently in the game that can set up hazards and mostly stop the opponent from removing hazards, and that being Gabademic. Not only it does have Provoke, but it does have the second highest speed stat to go first 99% of the time, and utility based moves to help bring momentum to the team, making it the best lead in the entire game. While Gabademic is really good for the lead position, you can also try to run Seer Knight or Wobblisk for a late game barb setting. An important thing to remember is that leads are not meant to be used after they've set up hazards. You could try and save Gabademic for a potential sack or revenge kill later on, but Gabademic is way too weak or not bulky enough to 1v1 other Lumions. The exception to this rule are of course other defensive barb setters because they could potentially set up barbs later or provide defensive utility. The next role on this list is pretty straightforward, and that is the core sweeper. But there is a lot of versatility in what picks you can choose, so don't fret. To start off, Hyper Offense is mostly, if not always, wants to be built around one core sweeper. This sweeper will have to show up late to the end of the battle and will need wall breakers to break walls near the beginning of the match so it can safely sweep and set up. Currently, sweepers in Lumion Legacy are Lumions that would really want to set up in order to do damage. A sweeper can range from Lumions with good coverage, setup, and a decent speed tier like Samurai, Ferroglyph, and Totab. You can also try to run slow but bulky Lumions like Casimir Cracked, but since Hyper Offense is centered around blitzing the opponent with strong Lumions, it is very much preferred to have sweepers that are really fast. While you can make things work with Casimir Cracked and others like it, having fast sweepers is much more preferred in my opinion. The wall breaking role is again what makes or breaks your team. This role is focused on doing as much damage as possible to give your sweepers a way in the battle to sweep. If your sweepers and wall breakers does not have any synergy, then you're automatically going to be losing a lot of your battles. The wall breaker slot is usually 2 to 3 party slots. The reason I say 2 to 3 is because sweepers can have a lot of walls, so running more wall breakers is pretty much ideal. Like I said earlier, this position is pretty dependent on what your sweeper is. To put it in face value, let's say your sweeper is weak to and walled by metal and water types. The most logical solution is having an electric type or an electric type wall breaker like Joltooth, Manitoot, or Halvantic to hit these types super effectively. However, this is not always going to be the case because Lumions have adapted to hold enough bulk to wall non-resistant hits. Barblast, Tyrex, Stratosaur, Venolin, Cinemars, and Tundrolin are great examples of this. Most Lumions that are below the 120 base attack range will most likely would be checked or walled by these guys. To give it a real game example, Totab is walled by Harvesect, Barblast, Obsidian, and variants of Chartiki. In order to defeat these walls, you need to run a couple of wall breakers to defeat them. The most damning examples are Gargolem Attack because it hits everything except Obsidian super effectively, Nemare because it does deal with all of these with setup, and Zeppelin or Wintrix can deal with these with ease. Now this is just the basics. As the game progresses and the meta switches up, you will be introduced to new factors and Lumions. Just know the basics that I have talked about in this video. And finally, this is the cleaner section. This is a pretty short section because cleaners have one job only, and that is to clean up whatever is left after you've broken the walls and you've made your sweeper do everything that you need to. You want to use these cleaners when you reach the end of your battle, when the opponent's Lumians are low HP or when they're low enough to be taken out. 9 times out of 10, you never want to send this during the middle or beginning of matches. However, the cleaning can be used for certain walls as bait that will give you the upper hand. For example, I can bring out a Zulong expecting their Tyrex. With this, I can now double into my Gargolem attack or other water types that can hit Tyrex super effectively, and I can get a free Earthquake or a free move off, which is pretty good. So with these roles out of the way, let's talk about counterplay. This is a pretty weird section because you have to play very differently against hyper offense compared to others. Usually, almost all hyper offense teams will lead with their suicides leads. With this knowledge in hand, you can force the opponent into a 50-50 situation. Bring out your strong wall breaker or any offensive Lumion that has very dangerous setup. If the opponent switches into a wall, they potentially have to lose their only way they can set up hazards, ruin their chances of setting up pressure, giving you the chance to set up or switch into a Lumion of your own. If the opponent chooses to stay in and attack or set up barbs, this also gives you a chance to set up, kill them in the next 2 turns, or switch into a Lumion that can get rid of their hazards like a Teardown Phasenaut or Gust Stratosaur. This is a really good situation to be in, but it might not work in your favor if your opponent chooses correctly. Another way to deal with hyper offense is not going to be consistent down the road, but there is a very broken hazard remover duo that kills any chance of setup. It is a bit play to win, but of course it's still a duo. If you fail to stop the hazards from setting, you have a very straightforward but hard to pull off strategy. Your main goal is to stop the wall breakers from killing you. From switching into resisted hits, forcing harder 50-50 matchups with super effective moves coming from bulkier or faster Lumions, pairing great defensive synergy to stall out the walls with passive damage over time, etc. This stage of the game is hard to give reliable advice on. Whatever you need to do, keep your walls that stop the wall breakers or the setup sweeper as much as you can. If you let the hyper offense user kill your walls, then this is an instant death. This is the conclusion of this video. This is a different type of video from my previous ones, mainly because I want to do the high quality video essays like I did with the Smithereens album review and different topics. So yeah, I guess this is a compromise for you guys. Sorry for leaving you guys in the dark for over a week. I had some essays and projects I needed to do. Thanks for supporting the channel, like the video if you enjoyed and find this video informational, and of course subscribe if you want to. Let me know what you want in terms of tips and further information and explanations down below, because this is just a very hard strategy to get the hang of at first, but it will be very easy once you master it or keep playing it over and over. For me, even I have to struggle with hyper offense a bit, and I do get clowned on by some people because hyper offense is the easiest strategy in the game. It's just that people have used bulky variants of team styles since the beginning, and now hyper offense looks pretty scary to get into, but it actually isn't that bad. So this is CounterPlay signing off to tell you that Zulong is still on dumpster fire.